Remember when I said that I loved the organic feeling of bringing your Dragon Ball OC to life in the world of Xenoverse 2? Yeah, good times. Welcome back, Game Roomies. We are on Summer Game number 4, and we're closing in on the end of the year, as well as the end of this series of videos. You know, it's interesting. Yakuza 6 kind of fell in the middle for me. Wasn't necessarily groundbreaking by any stretch, but it was a Yakuza game, and because of that, it was pretty good either way. The Messenger defied my expectations constantly and raised the bar for how I view the platforming genre, something that definitely translated to some of my feelings when I reviewed Sonic Mania as well. But this this one was different. Dragon Ball FighterZ was an experience that well, you'll see. Let me start by clarifying that in the spirit of fairness, I probably did not play this game the way it was originally intended. The very nature of my approach to this campaign demands that I see credits roll, and for a fighting game, that typically isn't the objective you're aiming for. But it's still a major mode included in the game, the story that is, and other fighting games have managed to make engaging story modes. See Mortal Kombat or the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm games. I don't think being a primarily multiplayer game is an excuse for single player being so, professionally speaking, stank. Dragon Ball FighterZ is a competitive fighting game based on, you guessed it, Dragon Ball. Unlike the classic games in the Dragon Ball series, this one is far more focused on traditional fighting game balance. There were certainly some older games that fit into this framework, like Butiden or Hyperdimension, as well as a few others, but a lot of them came out something close to 30 years ago, and at this point, they were Japan only, so most people probably haven't played them. That said, when this game was announced at E3 2017, best believe fans were all riled up, even with games like Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2 still receiving regular updates. I'll admit it took me a few years to warm up to the idea. I wouldn't consider myself particularly skilled at fighting games, but it's definitely a genre I have a lot of experience with, and I knew I'd grow tired of a game like FighterZ without substantial single-player content to keep my attention. That said, Dragon Ball FighterZ is a fun fighting game. It controls really well and simulates the feeling of massive-scale battles that the Dragon Ball series is known for, while remaining in a surprisingly confined and well-controlled space. Its use of cell shading and line work to simulate 2D imagery on 3D models not only manages to replicate some of Dragon Ball Z's original art direction, it actually ends up improving on it in quite a great many ways. Frame-for-frame recreations of classic moments scaled up for new hardware is surprisingly powerful, and as a fan of the series, it resonates deeper than I think even the likes of Xenoverse in some ways. I should also add that even beyond the adaptation of the source material, FighterZ pays very close attention to its contemporaries when developing its core set of mechanics. This isn't some licensed game garbage or anything, this is a game handled by some of the masters of the genre. Arc System Works, known for their work on games like BlazBlue, Guilty Gear, and Persona 4 Arena, they're also known for making games that look and play really well. It doesn't surprise me in the slightest that this game looks great and feels great. Familiar and new, all at the same time. Coming off the heels of a massive title like Xenoverse 2, it is easy to feel somewhat underwhelmed by the character roster here, but the characters presented tend to reflect their individual personality traits far better than the Xenoverse games ever could. Watching Vegeta's arms, for example, pulsate as he charges a final flash, or the subtle rage in Frieza's eyes as he charges towards you, and you'll understand exactly what I'm referring to. A character in this game is much more than a collection of signature moves. It's a realization of their expressions, a visual delivery of massive proportions that highlights everything worth loving about Dragon Ball Z, and anime as a medium. And then, after all of this, there was my experience with the game. Again, perhaps a flaw to my formula. All games don't warrant beating in the traditional sense. Yet still, I can't deny how utterly turned off I was by this game's story mode. And I say this not just because of the plot, either. I've been a Dragon Ball Z fan for decades, and I know that the stories have hiccups every now and again. Don't get me wrong, the series has its moments, but it's not exactly known for its Shakespearean quality character work. This narrative, however, had the makings of something very special. A new original character drawn by Toriyama himself to serve as the villain for the epic tale, Bad guys like Frieza and Cell returning from the dead and working together, the original voice casts in both English and Japanese, Beerus and Whis, some of my favorite characters in recent years, and the art direction itself. It lent so well to cutscenes, so it felt like this could have been something truly great. But what we got in turn was a story rushed, broken into these 3 arcs. The game uses the word arc to describe what you're up against in a respective section, but these aren't 3 narratives unfolding side by side. They're not 3 sections of a singular narrative split up for organization. They're 3 separate stories, with enough similarities to feel repetitive, but enough differences to leave you with contemplative questions like, huh? And what? Accolades aside, what really bogs this narrative down is a lack of fascinating character interactions. Rather than focusing on the collection of all-star characters and incredible voice artists that they brought into the fold, they chose to incorporate this soul-linking subplot, where each character is actually in canon being controlled by the soul of you, the player, and by fighting with them you unlock their deepest potential. I understand the need for a story like this. There has to be a way to make sense of Krillin being able to hold his own against Cell, for example. But it also feels like they're trying to make players feel like they're part of the story with Goku and friends, and having just come off the heels of a game that actually did that way better, it's alarming how shoehorned this section of the story feels. Now I realize I can't speak for all Dragon Ball fans. I acknowledge that I'm older than a lot of the target demographic here, but I'd have been just fine watching Frieza and Cell interact for my fan service, instead of Goku talking directly to me like we're buddies. I feel like it's odd for a traditional fighting game to try and service a need that a much more robust experience like Xenoverse managed to take care of and is still actively taking care of years later. I understand the reasoning, but ultimately the execution in my eyes feels sloppy. In addition to this, most of the story details are delivered through this weird clunky dialogue between Goku and the player character. There are some superstar additions to the narrative, make no mistake. Bulma and Krillin manage to carry a lot of the game's humor. The main villain, however, Android 21, leaves a lot to be desired. Again, I'm not looking for a super in-depth motivation from the game's villain, as no bad guy in Dragon Ball Z ever really had that. But it does feel weird to have this villain that's basically an amalgamation of storylines we've seen play out before. Gripes aside, I will say that the narrative is salvageable. It absolutely has some fun character interactions. I'm sure a lot of us, for example, wondered what it would be like if Vegeta and Nappa ever met again, and GT certainly didn't give us much of an answer to that question, so it's nice to have a game like this to fill in some of those gaps, even if everything feels somewhat speculative. Different team setups within the story mode will allow you to see special cutscenes for specific character pairings. Unfortunately, the criteria for these can be a bit vague, and they only appear once per grouping. So once you've seen a few of them, the rest will be few and far between. Make no mistake, Dragon Ball Z games aren't necessarily new to mediocre storylines. Ultimate Tenkaichi's was fairly rushed as well and focused on that same self-insert component. Budokai 2 abridged a lot of the original run story and was basically complete nonsense for anyone who hadn't seen the series before playing it. But those games were salvaged by fun and interesting combat that allowed you to mix up your style, and board game elements that kept navigating the world somewhat fun, as well as open worlds to explore in games like Budokai 3 and Tenkaichi 2. The story mode in FighterZ will drag you through repeated fights with the same clones of like 9 characters out of the roster. I get that they wanted to make use of said characters, they spent so much time building them out and refining them, but I would argue that by adding these filler fights and world maps and additional details, they turned what could have been a fun but interesting, mediocre linear story into a bloated nightmare that makes for easily one of the worst gaming experiences I've had this year. Even skipping over optional fights, you'll find yourself traversing an overworld map for far too long, and the maps themselves serve no functional purpose. They don't represent specific environments or story beats, they're just these weird pseudo-game boards full of generic battles that you have to grind through in order to see the next cutscene. In the case of one of the story's arcs, you literally fight through each map just to get the same cutscene with a different backdrop at the end of every chapter. In addition to that, There's this narrative beat that persists no matter which arc you're on, and it becomes so comical that I won't dare spoil it here. It's the story attempting to be dramatic and tragic, but knowing what we know about this franchise, we'll never be able to create that sense of urgency again, since, you know, Dragon Balls. I wish it were just the framing that made this get old too, but it really isn't. The combat of FighterZ is built for competitive play, and that's not everyone's cup of tea. It's honestly not mine either. But the game becomes more fun the more resistance you meet, as overcoming different playstyles, practicing, perfecting your skill set is inherent to the game's quality. The balancing in story mode fails to live up to that. You start in the first arc with there being tutorial battles, all the way through to the game's 15th map. Each map has at least 5 fights, so why would I ever need a tutorial for what is likely to be my 50th battle in the story mode? Then the second arc is still easy, with enemies barely even fighting you back most of the time, and finally the third arc continues to be easy most of the way through, and then crazy hard at the very end. Now, I'm not trying to imply that this is going to be everyone's experience, because I'm sure some people might have more challenge with it than I did, but I wouldn't consider myself particularly good at fighting games, and I ended up finding a lot of instances where I was able to easily overpower my enemies. The balancing is a lot better in the arcade mode, but I'll get to that later. Not to mention, this story mode actually uses this arbitrary leveling system where individual characters will gain stats and skills as you play. Now, Mustafa, most games have this, I hear you typing. Consider this. No other mode in this entire game utilizes anything to do with leveling up. Also, this is a team-based fighting game featuring an all-star cast based on an incredibly popular property. Why would you create a system that goes out of its way to punish me for using my favorite characters? Other characters in my roster don't gain any experience if they're not in the active party, so if I decide after my 20th match in a row to rotate out Cell and finally take Yamcha off the bench... No, wait, I'm sorry, that would actually never happen. And finally take Tien off the bench, I'm punished for doing so because he's considerably lower leveled than any of my other party members. I understand this logic in a game like Pokemon, where I can go back and forth to previous areas I've been to, or where I'm given individual targeted rewards for training certain members of my team, such as specific moves, compliments to my overall composition, and things of that sort. But again, this is a fighting game. There are too many fundamental similarities between the way each character plays to justify a system like this. And what's worse, it creates the illusion of strategic depth and RPG elements in a game that never needed them to begin with. I mean, other Arc System Works games have story modes that are usually just cutscenes with fights interspersed throughout. That's all I felt I really even needed out of this. And instead, I ended up punishing myself with the most painful grind I've had in a game in quite some time. Oh man. 2 full pages of that rant, so I'd be happy to change the subject. FighterZ has quite a bit to offer outside of its story mode, and most of the things outside of that mode are actually really solid. Anyone who chooses to embrace this game as the full-fledged fighter that it is will find themselves having a great time. The arcade modes offer a fun challenge with different paths based on story premises, and the roster is really fun. There are 3 Seasons Passes worth of DLC fighters, and players will find themselves satisfied with the extensive representation across Dragon Ball Z, GT, and Super. One thing battles offer outside of story mode is the ability to trigger these special cutscenes called dramatic finishes that harken back to some of the moments from the source material. These are honestly really cool, and thanks to the incredible visual style this game is sporting, they often feel like new life has been breathed into some of Dragon Ball's coolest moments. I always felt like Xenoverse failed to capture some of the spectacle of the source material in its cutscenes. The famous father-son Kamehameha, for example, had this drama and desperation to it in the anime that those games never really delivered on. But dramatic finishes hit the nail on the head, being almost one-to-one with the material they're adapting. The game also features a robust array of options for those wanting to play online or with friends. You can do team battles, one-on-ones, rings in your lobby where the loser rotates out of the match, and much more. These options create a real sense of versatility that varies the gameplay up quite a bit. In addition to this, the skill ceiling for this game is really high, higher than I'm personally willing to venture, but enough to give someone some real replay value. Personally, I'll stick to my Smash Bros for that sort of thing, but it is nice to have an option like this in the anime game arena that offers flavor as well as balance adhering to the source material. It won't be for everybody, and I acknowledge that. Some people might be more inclined to go for a Xenoverse than FighterZ. I'm probably in that group, but that's okay. It's nice to see that there's a little something for everyone. Also, I haven't discussed the soundtrack much, and that's largely because I just didn't pay that much attention to it. Story mode played like 3 songs over its cutscenes, which really wore thin on my nerves. Some character-specific themes are pretty cool though. Dragon Ball Super Broly has a nice track that came with his character, and the sound design overall is really well done. The sound effects are spot on to what fans of the anime will expect, down to subtle touches with the key blasts and such. The version of the game I got also came with some of the music from the original anime, so that's really cool. They did use the flow version of Chala Headchala, but I actually like that version as well. It doesn't measure up to the original, but still pretty rad all in all. For what it's worth, this game really does bring with it a solid respect to the multiplayer experience, and a nostalgic tribute to Dragon Ball Z specifically, even over Super GT and Dragon Ball. In spite of my experience with its story mode, it is a game I can comfortably recommend for that purpose, and it's usually on sale for dirt cheap in the US, so I'd say it's worth your time if you can swing it. Probably not a game I'll be coming back to anytime soon, but definitely a Dragon Ball brawl for the ages. Thank you all for tuning in to a review of Dragon Ball FighterZ, a game that in truth I desperately wanted to like more than I did. All the same, my campaign continues. Next up, I'll be bringing you guys my final summer game, followed by 2 more videos before the end of the year. Can't wait to see you guys for the next one. It'll be a blast. Thanks again for watching, and come back soon for more from the Game Room.